I was dead on my feet after a 48-hour trauma surgery shift. My 1-year-old daughter, Mia, slept heavily against my shoulder as I unlocked the door to my own home. I just wanted my bed. Instead, my living room was packed with my husband's entire family, staring in dead silence. Julian stepped forward and slammed a DNA test onto the coffee table. "She isn't mine," he said coldly. His mother pointed at the door. "Get out." Then I noticed my suitcase was already packed by the stairs, but before I could even react, my phone rang. If this unfairness makes your blood boil, tell me where and when you are watching this. The room waited for my breakdown. They expected tears, frantic begging, or a dramatic screaming match. That is what people do when their world suddenly shatters. But I am an attending trauma surgeon. When a patient crashes on the operating table, panic kills. You do not scream. You assess the damage. You stabilize the environment. You breathe. I looked at Julian. His chest heaved slightly, eagerly anticipating a fight. I looked at Margaret. Her chin was raised, completely ready to play the righteous, offended matriarch. Then I looked around my home, the historic Boston brownstone my father had left me. Something was profoundly wrong. Not just the ambush itself. The environment had been meticulously staged. Over by the entryway, my overnight bag sat completely packed. I had not packed it. On the kitchen counter. Julian's tablet lit up with an email notification. The sender was a local real estate agent. The subject line mentioned a staging consultation for tomorrow morning. My eyes drifted to the smart lock on the front door. A tiny red light blinked steadily. That specific light only appeared when a factory reset was scheduled for the next 12 hours. This was not a sudden emotional confrontation about a fake betrayal. This was an eviction. A highly coordinated, carefully timed eviction designed to catch me at my weakest point. I tightened my grip on Mia. She whimpered, burying her warm face into my scrub top. My priority was my patient, my daughter. I did not step closer to the coffee table. I did not pick up the papers Julian had thrown like a grenade. Instead, I shifted my weight, turned toward the hallway, and picked up the overnight bag they had so graciously packed for me. "Where do you think you are going?" Julian demanded. His voice cracked slightly. The script was not going the way he wrote it. He needed me to be hysterical. A hysterical woman is easy to record on a smartphone. A hysterical woman looks guilty. I adjusted the diaper bag over my shoulder. "I am leaving," I said quietly. The volume of my voice barely registered above Mia's soft cries. "You do not get to just walk away." Margaret stepped forward, her face flushed with sudden anger. "We know what you did during those late shifts. You humiliated my son." I looked directly into Margaret's eyes. I did not blink. I did not defend my honour. Defending yourself to people who have already convicted you is a complete waste of breath. I simply opened the heavy front door. The cold Massachusetts night air rushed in, chilling the sweat on the back of my neck. I stepped out onto the porch. Julian followed me to the threshold. "This is over, Gemma," he called out into the dark. "I want full custody." I paused on the top step. The jagged pieces of his plan were already clicking together in my mind. He wanted the house. He wanted the child. He wanted my total destruction. I looked at him one last time. "Good night, Julian." I walked down the steps. I secured Mia in her car seat, my hands completely steady. I did not look back. The car pulled away. I dropped Mia off at the hospital's secure daycare centre at 8:30 the morning after the ambush. I had slept on a narrow cot in an empty on-call room. My body felt like lead, but my mind was incredibly sharp. By 9 o'clock, my pager buzzed. It was an urgent summons to the Chief of Surgery's office. Dr. Marcus was not a man who called casual meetings. He was a pillar of the hospital, a man who respected strict protocol above all else. When I walked into his office, he was sitting behind his heavy oak desk, a single printed document resting in front of him. He did not offer me a seat. "Doctor," he said, his voice measured and grave. "We received an anonymous complaint to the medical board this morning." He turned the paper around and slid it toward me. I scanned the text. The complaint alleged that I was using my overnight trauma shifts to carry on an inappropriate relationship with an anesthesiologist. It claimed I frequently abandoned my post, compromised patient safety, and misused hospital facilities. The wording was incredibly specific. It mirrored the exact phrasing Julian had shouted the night before. This was the second knife. Julian was not satisfied with throwing me out of my home. He wanted to strip away my medical license. He wanted to cut off my income so I could not afford to fight back in court. If I lost my job, his emergency custody petition would look perfectly justified. A jobless, disgraced mother makes a very easy target. "This is a severe allegation," Marcus said, watching my face carefully. "Most administrators would suspend a doctor immediately just to protect the hospital's public reputation." "Is it true?" he asked. I met his gaze evenly. "No, sir, it is completely fabricated." Marcus folded his hands. He did not offer warm sympathy, but he also did not offer blind condemnation. "I operate on clinical data. Gemma, not rumours, not anonymous emails." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "I have already requested a full audit of your badge swipes for the last 90 days. I want the hallway camera footage pulled for every night shift you worked. I want the surgical logs and your access timestamps on the electronic health record system." Relief washed over me, cold and refreshing. Julian had calculated many things, but he did not understand how a hospital actually works. He thought an anonymous email would cause immediate bureaucratic panic. He did not realise that in a level 1 trauma centre, every breath, every footstep, and every door opened is digitally tracked and permanently recorded. "If you are innocent, the data will prove it," Marcus stated firmly. "Until then, you will continue your rounds." I nodded. "Thank you, Dr. Marcus." I turned to leave his office. The trap Julian set was about to snap backward. The hospital's security system was about to become my greatest alibi. I walked down the sterile white corridor. My career was fundamentally safe. Now, it was time to dissect the rest of his lies. The real work started now. I found a quiet corner in the surgical break room. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic filled the air. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. Before I walked out of my house last night, my eyes had quickly scanned the papers Julian threw on the coffee table. My photographic memory, trained by years of memorizing complex anatomical structures, had captured the layout of the document. I had also subtly snapped a picture while pretending to adjust Mia's blanket. Now, I zoomed in on the bright screen. It was supposedly a definitive DNA test proving Julian was not Mia's biological father. To a layman, the bold red letters spelling 0% probability looked utterly devastating. But I am not a layman. I am a scientist. I analyse laboratory reports every single day of my life. I started reading the fine print at the bottom of the page. The first glaring error was the complete lack of a medical identification code. There was no physician's signature authorising the test. The name printed at the top simply said Mia, completely omitting her middle name. But the most damning detail was a tiny line of text printed vertically along the right margin. It read, "For informational purposes only, not valid for legal proceedings." This was a cheap direct-to-consumer kit. It was not a court-ordered blood draw. In the medical and legal fields, there is a fundamental concept called the chain of custody. When we draw blood for a forensic kit, every person who touches that vial must sign for it. It is tracked from the vein to the laboratory to the courtroom. This ensures the sample is never tampered with, swapped, or contaminated. This internet test had zero chain of custody. Who swabbed the cheek? Who mailed the envelope? Whose saliva was actually hidden in that plastic tube? Julian presented it to his family as absolute truth. But in a courtroom, a judge would throw it out in 5 seconds. Then, a darker question crept into my mind. If Julian did not take Mia to a legitimate clinic, how did he get a sample? I thought back to the past few weeks. I recalled a specific afternoon when Margaret had unexpectedly volunteered to watch Mia. She had been unusually insistent. She told me to go upstairs and sleep after a long shift. When I woke up, Mia's favourite pink pacifier was missing. Margaret casually claimed she had simply lost it at the park. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My mother-in-law had stolen a pacifier from a 1-year-old child to harvest saliva for a fraudulent internet test. They had violated my daughter's basic privacy to manufacture a scandal. They used an innocent baby as a cheap prop in their theatre of cruelty. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about crafting a narrative. I locked my phone screen. The sadness I felt yesterday evaporated completely. It was replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. They thought I would cower in shame. They were wrong. A lab report is only as reliable as the hands that collected it. And Margaret's hands were incredibly dirty. The gloves were coming off. Later that evening, I drove to a nearby extended stay hotel. I set up a portable crib for Mia and watched her tiny chest rise and fall as she finally slept. Sitting alone in the dim light of the unfamiliar room, the adrenaline began to fade. In its place came the inevitable, haunting question. How did I let it get this far? For 5 years, I had been tethered to a failing marriage by an invisible chain of guilt. Julian was a master architect, not just of buildings, but of emotional realities. He built a persistent narrative where my ambition was the villain of our story. I remembered the night I received the Regional Surgical Excellence Award. I stood on a podium in a hotel ballroom, holding a glass plaque. The seat next to my colleagues was completely empty. When I came home, Julian was sitting on the couch drinking wine. I had a client crisis, he had said, not even looking away from the television. Some of us do not have a massive team of nurses to handle our daily emergencies. Instead of getting angry, I had apologised. I told myself he was right. I told myself my 80-hour work weeks were a heavy, unfair burden on him. Every missed anniversary, every cold shoulder, every passive-aggressive comment from Margaret, I absorbed it all. Margaret had aided him flawlessly. A truly good mother is always present, she would whisper while I poured coffee after a grueling night shift. Those tiny cuts bled out my self-esteem. They gaslighted me into believing that because I saved lives at work, I was neglecting my life at home. I became the perpetual apologiser. I compensated by paying for absolutely everything. I funded his architectural firm's overhead. I paid the heavy property taxes on the brownstone. I bought the groceries, hired the nanny, and smiled through the bone-deep exhaustion. It was a classic survival mechanism. I genuinely believed that if I just worked harder, if I just accommodated him more, eventually he would see my true value. But predators do not value their prey. They only value what they can successfully extract. Looking at Mia's peaceful face in the crib, the thick fog of the last 5 years totally lifted. Julian did not distance himself because he was lonely. Margaret did not constantly criticise me because she wanted a better daughter-in-law. They alienated me because it made it incredibly easy to use me, by keeping me constantly off balance and drowning in unwarranted guilt. They ensured I would never look too closely at the monthly bank statements. They ensured I would never question the late nights out or the hidden phone passwords. The invisible chain was not made of love or duty. It was made of pure manipulation. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the hotel room. I opened my laptop. I was done making pathetic excuses for a man who wanted to destroy me. I was done being the endlessly understanding wife. The guilt was completely burned away by the harsh reality of his betrayal. I opened a blank document and began to type out a timeline. The victim narrative died tonight. The morning sun reflected harshly off the glass doors of the downtown bank. I walked into the quiet lobby, holding my father's old brass key. My father had been a highly respected corporate attorney in Boston. He spent his entire career anticipating the worst in human nature, so his clients never had to. When he passed away, he left me the historic brownstone. But he did not just hand over the deed, he built a fortress around it. I sat in a private viewing room and opened the heavy metal safe deposit box. The smell of aged paper and dry ink filled the small space. Inside sat a thick, leather-bound folder. It contained the original documents for an irrevocable trust. When Julian and I married, he frequently suggested refinancing the brownstone to free up capital for his architectural firm. I always declined, citing sentimental value. I never explicitly told him about the rigid legal mechanism protecting the property. I turned the thick pages until I found the primary stipulations. My father had structured the trust with clinical paranoia. The document clearly stated that the property could not be sold, leveraged, or mortgaged under any circumstances without my physical signature. An electronic signature was entirely invalid. Furthermore, my signature had to be executed in the physical presence of our designated family attorney, Mr. Sterling. Julian's grand plan relied on forcing me out of the house, taking custody of Mia, and likely pressuring me into a quick settlement where I surrendered the asset to maintain peace. He thought the brownstone was simply a marital asset waiting to be liquidated. He had no idea he was trying to rob a heavily fortified vault with a plastic spoon. I picked up a sealed envelope resting at the bottom of the box. My name was written in my father's elegant cursive. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of stationery. I have spent my life protecting people from predators. The letter read, "You spend your life saving people when they are physically broken. Your dedication is your greatest gift. Gemma. But exhaustion makes us terribly vulnerable. I want to be absolutely sure that no one can ever leverage your exhaustion to take away your sanctuary." My chest tightened, but I did not cry. My father had seen through Julian years before I ever did. He recognised the subtle manipulation. He knew a day might come when I would be too tired to fight. He built this legal wall so I would not have to. I carefully placed the documents back into the folder and locked the metal box. Julian had spent months plotting to steal my home. Julian did not know. Stepping out of the bank, a chilling memory suddenly surfaced. It hit me with the precision of a scalpel. 7 months ago. My pager had been quiet for an hour. I was standing at the scrub sink outside operating room 4. I had my mask tied and my hands lathered in iodine soap. The double doors swung open. Julian walked into the restricted surgical corridor wearing a tailored suit. It was a massive violation of hospital protocol. He looked slightly frantic. Holding a thick stack of papers on a clipboard, he marched directly up to the sink. "I know you are busy," he had said quickly, holding out a sterilised pen. "But my accountant needs these tax disclosures signed immediately or the firm faces a massive late penalty. It is just standard joint filing paperwork. Please. Gemma." I was 14 hours into a brutal shift. My brain was completely saturated with patient charts, vital signs, and surgical approaches. I looked at the top sheet. It looked like a standard tax form. I rinsed my hands, grabbed a sterile towel, and reached for the pen. I was absolutely ready to sign it, just to get him out of the sterile area so I could focus on my job. Just as the tip of the pen touched the paper, the overhead intercom blared. It was a code blue. A massive internal hemorrhage was rolling into Trauma Bay 1. I dropped the pen instantly. "I have to go," I yelled, already running down the hallway. I glanced back for a fraction of a second. Julian was not looking at me with understanding or concern. His face was twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. He quickly shoved the clipboard into his briefcase and stormed out of the surgical wing. He never mentioned the supposed tax emergency ever again. Standing on the Boston sidewalk, the pieces snapped together perfectly. It was never a tax document. He had slipped a property waiver or a power of attorney form into the bottom of that stack. He knew I was chronically exhausted. He knew I trusted him. He deliberately bypassed normal channels and invaded my workplace to pressure me into signing away my rights while my mind was occupied with saving a life. He tried to exploit the exact vulnerability my father had warned me about. If that trauma patient had not crashed at that exact second, Julian might have successfully bypassed the trust. He almost stole my family home in the middle of a hospital corridor. I took a slow, deep breath. The manipulation was so profound it bordered on sociopathic. The patient saved my life. I returned to the hotel room and opened my laptop. I logged into our joint banking portal for years. I had been the sole provider of our stable income while Julian pursued his visionary architectural projects. I rarely scrutinised the daily expenditures because I trusted him to manage the household logistics while I managed surgical rotations. That blind trust ended today. I did not look for massive, glaring withdrawals. Predators rarely take giant bites that trigger alarm bells. They operate like a slow, internal bleed. You barely notice the drop in blood pressure until the organs start failing. I downloaded 12 months of banking data and exported it into a massive spreadsheet. I isolated Julian's business expenses. He regularly transferred money from our joint savings to cover his firm's overhead. I began to filter the transactions. I noticed a recurring vendor name popping up every few days. The transfers were always meticulously small. $400 here, $800 there, $1,200 on a Tuesday. The transaction notes were perfectly benign. They read, site survey materials, 3D rendering software license, and contractor retaining fee. To a casual observer, it looked exactly like the normal operational costs of a struggling design firm. But the sheer volume of these microtransactions was staggering. I highlighted the vendor column and ran a total sum calculation. The spreadsheet blinked for a second before producing the final number, $85,000. $85,000 had been slowly and quietly drained from the emergency fund I had built over 6 years of night shifts and holiday overtime. He had methodically funneled my salary out of our accounts while constantly complaining about our tight finances. He used my money while simultaneously orchestrating my public humiliation. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not feel a sudden urge to throw the laptop against the wall. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a definitive diagnosis. The vague feeling of unease I had harboured for months was finally validated by indisputable mathematical proof. Julian was not just unfaithful. He was a systematic thief. I looked at the vendor name again. The money had all been transferred to an entity listed simply as KI Designs. It sounded like an architectural consulting firm or a drafting service, but Julian had never mentioned partnering with a new design agency. He was incredibly, fiercely territorial about his firm's brand. I copied the vendor name into a blank document. I needed to know exactly where my $85,000 had gone. I needed to find out who was receiving the steady flow of my stolen wages. The parasite had a name. My cell phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. I let it ring. A moment later, a text message appeared on the screen. Gemma, it is Nora. Please call me back. I cannot sleep. Nora was Julian's aunt. She was a quiet, timid woman who had been sitting in the corner of my living room during the ambush. She had not joined Margaret in shouting at me, but she had not defended me either. She had simply watched as Julian threw the fake DNA test on the table. I picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. "Gemma." Nora whispered. Her voice was trembling badly. "I am so incredibly sorry. I should have said something. I should have stopped them." "You did not orchestrate it." "Nora," I replied evenly. "Julian did." "You do not understand," she said, her breathing shallow. "It was not just Julian. They planned the whole thing. The reaction. The timing. They wanted you to look insane." My pulse steadied. "What do you mean?" "Check your messages. I just sent you everything. I cannot be a part of this family's lies anymore." Nora hung up. 12 image files popped into my message thread. I opened the first one. It was a screenshot of a private family group chat. The chat was titled "The Transition." The members included Julian, Margaret, Nora, and 3 other relatives who had been present. I read the messages chronologically. They had been plotting this specific confrontation for nearly 3 weeks. Margaret: "Make sure you position yourself near the door." Julian: "We need to block her from going upstairs to the bedroom." Julian: "I have the papers ready. I will throw them on the table exactly when she walks in. Everyone needs to look completely disgusted." Margaret: "If she starts yelling, immediately start recording her on your phones. A judge will love seeing a hysterical doctor acting erratically. It will guarantee you get full custody of Mia." Huge Julian: "Make sure Mia starts crying. Gemma will panic if the baby is upset. We need her flustered and irrational before I present the settlement offer." I scrolled through image after image. They had choreographed my emotional destruction. They treated my trauma like a community theatre production. They actively planned to terrorize a 1-year-old child to elicit a predictable psychological response from a tired mother. Nora sent one final text. "I am willing to testify to this. Whatever you need." I saved every single image to a secure cloud server. This was not a messy, emotional, marital dispute anymore. This was documented. Premeditated conspiracy to commit emotional abuse and manipulate a potential custody battle. The group chat transformed their attack from an unfortunate family conflict into actionable legal evidence. The ambush was fully scripted. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I hired an independent forensic accountant. I securely transmitted the banking spreadsheets and the specific vendor information for KA Designs. I paid his expedited retainer fee without hesitation. I need to know exactly what this entity is, who owns it, and where the funds physically reside. I told him over the phone. "Give me 4 hours," he replied. I spent the morning organising Mia's schedule and reviewing my hospital rotation calendar. I functioned with total mechanical efficiency. By 11:15, the accountant sent an encrypted email to my private inbox. I opened the comprehensive report. Designs was entirely a ghost. It possessed no physical office address, no registered employees, and no history of corporate tax filings. The business address linked to the banking routing number was nothing more than a commercial post office box located in a strip mall across town. But the forensic trail did not stop there. The accountant had tracked the final destination of the deposited funds. The money had not stayed in the shell company's account. It had been systematically forwarded into a certified real estate escrow account. I scrolled down to the ownership registry. The registered agent for KA Designs was a woman named Kayla Adams. A quick search of the state licensing database revealed that Kayla Adams was not an architect, a materials supplier, or a software developer. She was a licensed luxury real estate broker. Julian had not been paying for 3D rendering software. He had been using my money to fund a clandestine real estate transaction. The $85,000 had been aggregated to serve as a massive down payment on a high-end two-bedroom condominium in the financial district. I looked at the closing documents the accountant had legally obtained from public property records. The condominium was purchased solely under the name of K. Air Designs. Julian had carefully kept his own name completely off the official deed to hide the asset during our inevitable divorce. He was building a luxurious new life for himself and his mistress, and he was using my surgical shifts to pay for the bricks. The audacity was almost scientifically fascinating. He had accused me of infidelity to throw a smokescreen over his own massive financial fraud. He intended to kick me out of my father's brownstone, secure custody of Mia to avoid paying child support, and walk away with a secret condominium funded entirely by my labour. I closed the PDF report. I now possessed the complete anatomy of his betrayal. I had the fraudulent DNA test. I had the group chat proving premeditation. I had the money trail leading directly to Kayla Adams. The disease was fully mapped. The betrayal was meticulously funded. I sat in the hospital cafeteria, turning a spare pink pacifier over in my hands. The silicone was perfectly clean. My mind drifted back to the fake DNA report sitting on my coffee table. The tiny letters on the margin stated the sample was unverified. Someone in that living room had physically obtained my daughter's genetic material. I retraced the events of the past month with clinical precision. 3 weeks ago, Margaret had visited the brownstone unannounced. She was excessively cheerful. She insisted I looked deeply exhausted and practically pushed me up the stairs to take a nap. "Let Grandma have some quality time with her beautiful girl," Margaret had cooed. I had slept for exactly 2 hours. When I came downstairs, Margaret was packing her purse quickly. She claimed Mia had dropped her favourite pacifier during a walk in the park, and it was lost forever. I had simply bought a new one. Now. The missing piece of the puzzle slid into place with sickening clarity. Margaret had not lost the pacifier. She had stolen it. She had taken an object straight from a 1-year-old baby's mouth, slipped it into a plastic bag, and mailed it to a discount commercial laboratory. In a clinical setting, obtaining a genetic sample requires informed consent, photo identification, and a tamper-evident seal. Margaret bypassed every ethical boundary imaginable. She violated her own granddaughter's basic biological privacy just to manufacture a scandal. There was no legal chain of custody. There was no medical professional ensuring the integrity of the sample. There was only an angry, manipulative woman rubbing a piece of silicone against a cheap cotton swab. Margaret had stood in my living room, pointing a trembling finger at me, playing the role of a devastated grandmother perfectly. But she knew the entire premise was a fabricated lie. She knew because her own hands were the ones that committed the fraud. The level of moral bankruptcy required to use an infant as a prop in an eviction scheme was staggering. They did not see Mia as a human being. They saw her as a highly effective lever to pry me out of my father's house. I placed the spare pacifier back into my bag and zipped it shut. I felt absolutely no sadness anymore. Empathy requires a human subject, and the people who orchestrated that ambush had sacrificed their humanity for greed. They wanted to play a dirty game of accusations and assumptions. But I only play games I can win with verifiable data. They thought they had secured a devastating emotional victory. In reality, they had only provided me with a roadmap of their profound desperation. The innocence was completely gone. At noon, my pager beeped again. Dr. Marcus requested my immediate presence in his office. I walked through the double doors and took a seat across from his massive desk. He did not look angry. He looked deeply satisfied. "The internal audit is complete, Gemma," Marcus said, turning his computer monitor toward me. "I do not tolerate false accusations in my department." He brought up a digital spreadsheet. It was a comprehensive log of my hospital badge swipes for the exact night the anonymous complaint alleged I was abandoning my surgical post. The data was perfectly sequential. At 11:14, I was in the scrub room. At 11:20, I entered operating room 4. The system registered me exiting the surgical suite at 3:45 in the morning. I was continuously locked in a sterile environment for over 4 hours. Marcus then opened a second window. It displayed high-definition security footage from the staff parking garage. It was the exact photograph Julian had used in his fake detective report. The image showed me walking next to Dr. Evans, the senior anesthesiologist. We both looked exhausted. The anonymous email claimed this photo was taken on a Tuesday night during a secret rendezvous, Marcus stated flatly. He zoomed in on the timestamp embedded in the raw video file. The metadata clearly shows this was recorded on a Friday morning, specifically, immediately after the 10-car pile-up on the interstate. I remembered that morning perfectly. We had operated back-to-back for 16 hours. Dr. Evans had simply walked me to my car because my hands were shaking too badly to hold my keys. The picture was completely real, but the context had been entirely fabricated. Julian had taken an innocent moment of professional solidarity and twisted it to fit his narrative. He altered the timestamp to match his fictional timeline. The hospital administration stands behind you completely, Marcus said, handing me a printed envelope. I have drafted a formal letter of exoneration. We will provide certified copies of these system logs to any legal counsel you choose. The sheer power of documented truth washed over me. Julian tried to use my demanding career to prove I was a negligent wife. Instead, the rigorous, heavily monitored nature of that exact career provided an impenetrable alibi. You cannot gaslight a digital access log. You cannot manipulate a secure server timestamp. My job was not my weakness. It was my absolute armour. The truth was finally documented. At 4 o'clock, I walked into the mahogany-panelled office of Attorney Sterling. He had been my father's closest legal colleague for 3 decades. He possessed a sharp mind and a completely ruthless dedication to his clients. He poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat across from me. I opened my briefcase. I did not cry. I did not complain about a broken heart. I simply unloaded the data. I handed him the fraudulent DNA printout, the comprehensive badge swipe logs from Dr. Marcus, the forensic accountant's report detailing the stolen $85,000, and the screenshots of the family group chat Nora had bravely provided. Sterling put on his reading glasses and reviewed the documents in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock. After 10 minutes, he lowered his glasses and looked at me. Your father always said you had an incredibly analytical mind. Gemma, he remarked softly. He was entirely correct. I need to secure my daughter and my house, I stated plainly. Julian wants to use emergency custody to force a real estate settlement. Sterling picked up the original copy of the irrevocable trust my father had drafted. Julian is playing checkers while standing on a chessboard, Sterling said with a slight, predatory smile. This trust is an absolute iron wall. He cannot touch the brownstone, and with this financial trail leading directly to a mistress's condominium, his custody argument is completely dead on arrival. Sterling pointed a pristine fountain pen at the DNA test. This piece of paper is legally worthless. There is 0 chain of custody. If his lawyer even attempts to submit this to a family court judge, they will be heavily sanctioned for presenting unverified evidence. We spent the next 2 hours outlining the legal strategy. It was exactly like prepping for a complex, high-risk surgery. We identified the primary threats, mapped out the precise incisions we needed to make, and anticipated his defensive maneuvers. We were not going to file a standard, emotional divorce petition. We were going to file a massive, heavily documented civil complaint for financial fraud, marital waste, an intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were going to bury Julian under a mountain of his own verifiable lies. I drank the bitter coffee. I felt a profound sense of peace. The panic and confusion of the ambush were entirely gone. My father had given me the shield. Sterling was handing me the sword. The surgical extraction had begun. My phone vibrated softly in the passenger seat as I drove back to the hotel. The caller ID flashed Julian's name. I let it ring 3 times, allowing my heart rate to remain completely steady before pressing the answer button. "Hello, Julian," I said. My voice was perfectly flat. "Gemma," he began, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured exhaustion. "I think we need to handle this like mature adults. The family is incredibly upset, but I want to keep this out of court for Mia's sake." I kept my eyes on the road. "Go on." "I am willing to be highly reasonable," Julian continued, completely unaware of the massive trap closing around him. "If you sign the brownstone over to me, I will drop the formal infidelity accusations. We can arrange shared custody. You will not have to pay me any alimony, and we can just walk away quietly. It is the best scenario for your medical career." I almost laughed. His audacity was truly spectacular. He had stolen my savings, bought a secret apartment for his mistress, and orchestrated a public humiliation. Now, he was offering to generously forgive me for a crime I did not commit, provided I paid him with a multi-million-dollar historic property. He was utilizing the classic abuser tactic, create a massive, terrifying crisis, and then graciously offer a terrible solution that solely benefits the abuser. He expected me to be terrified of losing my medical license. He expected me to be desperate to avoid a public scandal. He needed me to fold. "I appreciate your offer, Julian," I said, my tone remaining entirely clinical. "But I will not be signing over my father's house." "Gemma, do not be stupid." His voice hardened, the faux compassion instantly dropping. "If we go to court, I will use that DNA test. I will use your 80-hour work weeks against you. You will lose Mia. We will discuss the custody schedule through our legal representatives," I replied smoothly. "Have your lawyer contact Richard Sterling." I pressed the end call button. I did not block his number. I did not argue with him about his affairs or his stolen money. Every threat he made was just another piece of evidence. Every arrogant demand only strengthened my case. He thought he was intimidating a panicked housewife. He was digging his grave. The next morning, Sterling called me with a significant update. I pulled the property records and the mortgage application for Kayla Adams's new condominium. He announced, "You need to come to my office to see this." I arrived 30 minutes later. Sterling had a large architectural rendering spread across his conference table. "Kayla's name is solely on the deed," Sterling explained, pointing to the paperwork. "But the developer required a certified architect to sign off on the interior modifications before closing. Look at the title block." I looked down. The official stamp belonged to Julian's architectural firm, but that was not the most devastating detail. I studied the detailed floor plan. One of the secondary bedrooms had been extensively modified with custom built-in shelving. The label on the blueprint read, "J Study." Julian was not just helping a client, he was designing his own future home office using my stolen money. Then, my eyes drifted to the 3D digital rendering of the dining area attached to the blueprints. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The digital furniture placed in the mock-up was highly specific. It was a massive, antique oak dining table with intricately carved claw feet. It was the exact table currently sitting in my brownstone. It was a family heirloom my father had imported from England. Julian had actually taken measurements and photographs of my family's antique table to drop into the digital rendering of his love nest. He fully intended to move my heritage into the apartment he bought with my savings. The absolute arrogance of the blueprint was breathtaking. He had planned the logistics of my replacement down to the very last millimetre of oak. If you believe that documented facts are the best revenge against toxic manipulation, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I tapped the rendering with my index finger. The evidence was undeniably perfect. Julian had left his professional signature all over his infidelity. He had documented his own premeditated theft. He thought he was a brilliant architect designing a flawless escape. He failed to realise he had drafted the exact blueprints of his own destruction. The blueprint was completely flawless. The legal machinery of a forensic investigation moves with brutal efficiency. Once Attorney Sterling had the routing numbers and the shell company details, he did not hesitate. He immediately filed a targeted subpoena for all communication and financial records associated with Kayla Adams and KA Designs. He served the legal notice directly to her real estate brokerage office. At exactly 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, my personal cell phone vibrated. I was sitting in my hospital office, reviewing post-operative charts. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I answered it with my standard, even tone. "Dr. Gemma speaking," I said. "Gemma?" a woman's voice whispered. The voice was trembling so violently I could barely understand the syllables. "It is Kayla. Kayla Adams." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair. I did not hang up. I did not yell at her for destroying my marriage. I simply waited. In the medical field, when a patient is in profound distress, you let them provide the symptoms before you attempt to diagnose the root cause. "I received the legal papers from your lawyer," Kayla continued, her breath hitching. "You have to believe me. I did not know about the money. I did not know he was stealing from your accounts." "What exactly did you know, Kayla?" I asked quietly. "Julian told me you two had been legally separated for over a year." She sobbed. "He said you were incredibly hostile. He claimed the brownstone was entirely his property, and you were only refusing to leave out of pure spite. He said the $85,000 was his personal architectural bonus. I swear to you, I never would have signed the escrow documents if I knew the funds belonged to you." I listened to her panicked explanation. The architecture of Julian's deceit was truly breathtaking. He had not just lied to me, he had manipulated his mistress with the exact same sociopathic precision. He created a fictional universe where he was the wealthy, victimized husband, and I was the unstable, greedy wife. He told me you agreed to sell the brownstone as soon as the divorce was finalized. Kayla wept. He promised we would move the antique dining table into the new condominium. I did not know he was orchestrating a massive financial fraud. Your lawyer is threatening me with criminal conspiracy charges. Julian had successfully isolated Kayla, feeding her a curated narrative to ensure her compliance. But he made one critical, catastrophic miscalculation. He placed the entire legal liability of the real estate purchase onto her shoulders by using designs to hide his involvement. He effectively abandoned her on the front lines of a financial crime. When faced with the terrifying prospect of a federal prison sentence, the illusion of romance shatters instantly. Kayla was no longer a devoted mistress dreaming of a stolen antique table. She was a terrified civilian staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. "If you want immunity, you will provide my lawyer with every single text message," I stated coldly. "I will," she cried. The mistress was completely terrified. By 10 o'clock the following morning, a massive encrypted digital file arrived in Attorney Sterling's secure inbox. Kayla had completely capitulated. She surrendered over a year of text messages, emails, digital voice notes, and shared calendar invitations. I sat in Sterling's office, drinking a cup of black coffee. We projected the text threads onto the large conference room screen. Reading through a spouse's infidelity is supposedly a devastating emotional experience. But looking at the screen, I felt absolutely nothing. It read exactly like a clinical pathology report. I was merely studying the progression of a highly aggressive disease. The messages revealed the precise timeline of his premeditated attack. Julianne, the market is perfect right now. Once she's officially out of the brownstone, the sale will be incredibly fast. We will have the capital to expand KA designs globally, Kayla. Are you absolutely sure she will just leave? She seems incredibly stubborn. Julian. She works 80 hours a week at the hospital. She's constantly exhausted and permanently plagued by working mother guilt. I just need to apply the right emotional pressure. My mother is going to help me stage an intervention. We are going to break her. I stared at the glowing white letters. He viewed my medical career as a convenient psychological weakness. He intended to weaponize my dedication to my patients against me. Sterling clicked to the next set of messages. They were dated just 3 days before the ambush in my living room. Julian. The fake laboratory report arrived today. It looks incredibly authentic. Margaret is going to invite the entire extended family over on Friday night. Gemma is coming off a 48-hour trauma shift. Her brain will be completely fried. She will likely sign whatever settlement I put in front of her just to avoid a massive public scene. Sterling paused the projection. He looked at me across the mahogany table. He did not just attempt to steal your assets, Gemma. He attempted to execute a psychological assassination. I nodded slowly. He wanted me to doubt my own sanity. He wanted me to believe that my dedication to my surgical career made me an unfit mother and a terrible wife. He used his own family as an audience to maximize the trauma. Kayla had also provided the original, unredacted email threads concerning the interior design of the condominium. Julian had explicitly instructed her to register the LLC solely in her name. When Kayla questioned the legality of the funding source, Julian had immediately threatened to leave her. He deliberately trapped her in a cycle of financial dependency. When Kayla finally realised she was holding the bag for an $85,000 embezzlement scheme, her loyalty evaporated. She handed us the exact ammunition we needed to destroy his fictional victim narrative. We possessed the absolute truth, completely verified by his own digital fingerprints. The trap was fully loaded. We had the financial records. We had the fraudulent DNA kit details. We had the group chat proving Margaret's complicity. We had the mistress's confession. But Attorney Sterling is a man who leaves absolutely nothing to chance. He operates with the same redundant safety protocols I use in an operating theatre. He walked over to a wall of filing cabinets and pulled down a heavy, dust-covered cardboard box. It was the original archived file from my father's estate planning. Julian's entire strategy hinges on the assumption that the brownstone is a shared marital asset, Sterling explained, blowing a thin layer of dust off a manila folder. He assumes that even with the irrevocable trust in place, a highly sympathetic family court judge might grant him temporary residential rights if he successfully claims you are an unstable, negligent mother. Sterling opened the folder, but Julian has a very short memory. He extracted a single, yellowed piece of paper. The document was dated exactly 9 years ago. It was during our first year of marriage. Julian had decided to leave his corporate architecture job to launch his own independent firm. He needed a massive commercial line of credit to secure office space and purchase rendering equipment. The bank required a thorough asset declaration. To prevent the bank from placing a lien on the brownstone in the event of his business failing, your father required Julian to sign a specific document before releasing any initial funding. Sterling said. He slid the paper across the desk. It was a disclaimer of marital interest. I read the legal terminology. The document explicitly stated that Julian legally acknowledged the historic brownstone was my sole, separate, and inherited property. He formally waived any current or future rights to the home, regardless of any financial contributions he might make toward its maintenance or improvement. At the bottom of the page, in bold blue ink, was Julian's unmistakable signature. It was notarized. It was permanent. He signed away his rights a decade ago, just to get his startup cash. Sterling smiled coldly. He happily sacrificed his legal claim to your sanctuary because it benefited him financially at the time. Now, he intends to walk into this office tomorrow and demand the exact property he legally renounced. If you are ready to witness the power of absolute, documented truth, let me know in the comments below. I looked at the signature. This was the final, fatal dose. Julian's entire scheme was built on a foundation of legal ignorance. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he forgot the binding contracts he had signed. He was walking into a war zone armed with fake internet tests and manipulated family members. We were armed with heavily audited financial data, verified server logs, and his own notarized confessions. The preparation phase was officially complete. The patient was prepped. The surgical instruments were meticulously arranged on the sterile tray. The operation was completely ready. Friday morning arrived with clear, freezing Boston weather. I walked into Attorney Sterling's primary conference room at exactly 9:45. I wore a tailored navy blue suit. My posture was perfectly straight. My resting heart rate hovered at a calm 60 beats per minute. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Julian strode into the room. He wore a highly expensive Italian suit, carrying himself with the exaggerated confidence of a man who believes he has already won the war. Margaret followed closely behind him. She clutched a designer handbag, her chin raised in a portrait of offended aristocratic dignity. They were accompanied by a sharply dressed, aggressive-looking family law attorney. We did not exchange pleasantries. Julian did not look me in the eye. He took a seat across the wide mahogany table. His lawyer immediately opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Let us save everyone some valuable time," Julian's lawyer began, his voice dripping with condescension. "My client is profoundly devastated by the recent revelations regarding Dr. Gemma's infidelity. However, he is willing to be exceptionally generous to protect his daughter from a brutal public trial." Sterling sat silently, his hands folded neatly over a closed leather binder. Julian's lawyer slid a proposed settlement agreement across the polished wood. "If your client immediately vacates the brownstone and signs over the deed, my client will not submit this definitive DNA report to the court. He will accept primary custody of Mia, and we will not pursue aggressive alimony for his emotional distress. It is a highly favourable exit strategy for a woman in her compromised professional position." I looked down at the settlement offer. It was a masterpiece of intimidation. They were demanding my ancestral home and my only child, wrapping the extortion in the language of a generous compromise. I looked at Margaret. A faint, self-satisfied smile played on the corners of her mouth. She genuinely believed her theatrical performance in my living room had successfully broken my spirit. They expected me to cry. They expected me to panic about the fake DNA test destroying my reputation. They expected the exhausted, guilty surgeon to surrender immediately to avoid further conflict. I did not touch the paper. I simply leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and profoundly uncomfortable. Julian shifted in his leather chair. His lawyer cleared his throat, suddenly unsure how to interpret my complete lack of emotional reaction. In a trauma bay, you do not react to the noise. You control the environment. I let them speak first. "Are we ready to proceed?" Julian's lawyer asked, his confidence fracturing slightly under the heavy silence. I looked directly at Julian. "You have been exceptionally busy over the last 12 months. Julian, I commend your dedication to accounting. I nodded to Sterling. My lawyer slowly opened the thick leather binder resting on the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not exhibit anger. He simply began presenting the clinical data. Exhibit A, Sterling announced smoothly, sliding a heavily highlighted spreadsheet across the table. A comprehensive forensic audit of the joint marital accounts. Over the past 52 weeks, your client has systematically diverted exactly $85,000 into an unregistered corporate entity. Julian's face immediately lost its colour. The smug arrogance vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid panic. Those are standard business operational expenses, Julian stammered quickly, looking at his own attorney for support. My architectural firm requires massive capital for material surveys. Exhibit B, Sterling continued, completely ignoring Julian's frantic interruption. He slid a second document forward. The official state registry for the corporate entity known as Kayla A. Designs. The sole registered agent is Kayla Adams, a licensed real estate broker. Margaret gasped softly. She turned to look at her son, genuine confusion flashing across her face. She knew about the fake DNA test. She did not know about the massive financial embezzlement. Exhibit C, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was razor sharp. I slid a large, glossy architectural rendering across the mahogany. The closing documents for a luxury two-bedroom condominium in the financial district, purchased entirely in cash by K.A. Designs, accompanied by a custom floor plan containing a highly specific J study. Julian stared at the blueprint. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. His lawyer frantically flipped through the documents, realising he had walked into an ambush completely blind. My client has effectively subsidised your client's extramarital affair and real estate portfolio using her grueling surgical shifts. Sterling stated, his tone lethal. In the state of Massachusetts, this constitutes egregious marital waste and severe financial fraud. Julian slammed his hand on the table. You cannot prove I knew about that purchase. Kayla is just a contractor. I pushed the final stack of paper toward him. It was a printed transcript of over 400 text messages. Exhibit D, I whispered. Kayla was remarkably cooperative after receiving a federal subpoena regarding wire fraud. She provided every message, including the ones where you explicitly promised her my antique oak dining table. The room plunged into absolute suffocating silence. The mountain of verified data had crushed his meticulously crafted narrative into dust. There was no room for debate. There was no room for emotional manipulation. Numbers do not lie, and blueprints do not invent themselves. The architect was completely ruined. Julian sat completely paralysed in his expensive Italian chair. The revelation of the condominium and his mistress's full cooperation had effectively severed his vocal cords. But Margaret was not ready to surrender. She had spent her entire life controlling the family narrative, and she refused to let a spreadsheet defeat her. She leaned forward, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. Her eyes darted from the blueprints back to me. This is an obvious distraction, Margaret declared, attempting to project maternal authority. Her voice wavered only slightly. Julian may have made some unfortunate financial miscalculations in his business, but that does not erase your sins. Gemma, we all saw the DNA report. You cannot use his mistakes to cover up the fact that you brought an illegitimate child into my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at her. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out the small, clear plastic bag containing Mia's spare pink pacifier. I placed it gently on top of the mahogany table. Margaret's eyes locked onto the plastic. The colour instantly drained from her face. Exhibit E, Sterling announced, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. A verified report from a pediatric forensic specialist regarding the DNA sample your family submitted. I looked directly into Margaret's terrified eyes. You volunteered to watch Mia so I could sleep. While I was unconscious in the next room, you stole a pacifier straight from your 1-year-old granddaughter's mouth. You sealed it in an envelope and mailed it to a discount, unregulated facility. A facility that explicitly states their results are not legally admissible. I was protecting my son, Margaret stammered, shrinking back into her heavy leather chair. You were fabricating a scandal, I corrected her, my voice perfectly level. You bypassed every ethical and legal standard of medical privacy, but your execution was incredibly sloppy. Sterling handed a thick stack of printed screenshots to Julian's lawyer. These are transcripts from a private family group chat, generously provided by a relative who could no longer stomach the conspiracy. In these messages, Margaret explicitly instructs the family to provoke my client. She actively plans to terrorize an infant child just to record a highly emotional reaction on a smartphone. Julian's lawyer read the highlighted text. He slowly closed his file folder. He realized his clients were not victims. They were the architects of a malicious, coordinated psychological assault. You viewed my daughter as a prop, I said to Margaret. You used her to create a theatrical performance for your relatives. You sacrificed your own humanity to win an argument. Margaret covered her mouth with her trembling hand. She had no defense. The righteous matriarch mask had been completely shattered, exposing the desperate, manipulative reality beneath. She looked to Julian for help, but he was still staring blankly at the blueprints of his ruined future. The moral high ground was gone. The silence in the conference room was incredibly heavy. Julian's lawyer cleared his throat, desperately searching for a tiny piece of leverage to salvage his sinking ship. He abandoned the infidelity narrative entirely. He pivoted to the only asset left on the table. Regardless of the highly regrettable circumstances surrounding the condominium purchase, the lawyer stated smoothly, the fact remains that Julian and Gemma have been married for 5 years. During that time, marital funds were utilised to maintain the Boston brownstone. My client is legally entitled to 50% of the equity in that primary residence. Julian seemed to revive at this. He sat up slightly straighter. He still believed the house was his ultimate safety net. He believed the brick and mortar of my father's legacy would ultimately pay for his mistakes. Attorney Sterling did not argue. He simply smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. He slowly pulled the final yellowed document from the archived estate file. Exhibit F, Sterling said softly. He slid the 9-year-old paper across the polished wood. Julian's lawyer picked it up. His eyes scanned the legal terminology. I watched Julian's face as his own attorney read the specific clauses. The document was the disclaimer of marital interest. 9 years ago, Julian required a massive commercial line of credit to launch his architectural firm. Sterling explained to the room, the bank required a strict separation of assets. To secure his startup capital, Julian formally and permanently legally acknowledged that the historic brownstone was the sole, separate, and non-marital property of Dr. Gemma. Julian snatched the paper from his lawyer's hands. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he recognised his own blue ink signature at the bottom of the page. You waived your rights a decade ago, Sterling concluded. The irrevocable trust prevents the sale of the house, and your own signature prevents you from claiming a single penny of its value. You have absolutely no legal standing to demand equity. The final pillar of Julian's grand plan collapsed into dust. He had orchestrated an incredibly complex, emotionally devastating eviction to steal a house he had legally surrendered 9 years earlier. His own greed had engineered his absolute ruin. Gemma, please, Julian whispered. His voice was broken, completely stripped of its former arrogance. He leaned across the table, his hands trembling. I was stressed. The firm was failing. I made a terrible mistake. We can fix this. Please, do not do this to me. I looked at the man I had spent 5 years apologising to. I looked at the man who had used my 80-hour hospital shifts to fund his betrayal. I felt no pity. I felt no desire for vengeance. I simply felt the profound relief of a successful surgical extraction. You did not make a mistake, Julian, I said calmly. You made a blueprint, and it failed. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my suit. The surgery is over. I walked toward the heavy glass doors. I was ready to leave the ruins of my marriage behind. But a desperate man is a dangerous entity. Julian stood up abruptly, knocking his leather chair backward. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the polished room. "You think you can just walk away? I am filing an emergency custody petition for Mia. Right now!" His lawyer quickly pulled a drafted petition from his briefcase, clearly instructed to use it as a last resort. My client is prepared to argue that Dr. Gemma's grueling surgical schedule renders her an unfit primary caregiver. We have video evidence of her erratic behaviour and hospital logs proving she works an unsafe number of hours. It was the false counterattack, the final desperate thrashing of a cornered predator. He was trying to use the societal guilt of a working mother to force a concession. I stopped. I turned around slowly. I did not panic. I had anticipated this exact manoeuvre. "Let us discuss your dedication to parenting," I said evenly. I reached into my briefcase and produced a certified log from the hospital's secure daycare centre. I placed it on the table. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, Mia developed a high fever at daycare, I stated. I was in the middle of a complex spinal reconstruction. The daycare centre called your cell phone 4 separate times. Julian swallowed hard. He knew exactly what day I was referencing. You declined every single call. I continued mercilessly. You texted the head nurse, claiming you were in a critical client meeting and could not be disturbed. You demanded they interrupt my surgery instead. I picked up the spreadsheet of his text messages with Kayla. I pointed to the precise timestamp. According to the metadata in these messages, you were not in a client meeting. You were standing in the primary bedroom of Kayla's new condominium, debating the colour of the paint. You abandoned your sick 1-year-old daughter for a real estate tour with your mistress. Julian's lawyer stared at the daycare logs. He silently slid the emergency custody petition back into his briefcase and snapped it shut. Submitting that petition now would be career suicide. I manage my schedule to provide completely for my child, I told Julian. You view her as a bargaining chip. If you ever attempt to threaten my custody again, I will submit these logs to a family court judge and request a permanent restriction on your visitation rights. Julian collapsed back into his chair. He buried his face in his hands. He had no leverage, no money, and no house. His counterattack had shattered against the impenetrable wall of factual data. I turned back to the door and pushed it open. I walked out into the bright Boston morning. The threat was permanently neutralised. The consequences of documented truth are swift and completely unforgiving. Over the next 3 months, the intricate web Julian had woven rapidly disintegrated. Once Kayla realised Julian was entirely financially dependent on my surgical income, the illusion of their grand romance dissolved. She was holding the mortgage on an expensive condominium, and Julian had zero capital to contribute. Faced with the reality of an unemployed, disgraced partner, she did exactly what self-preservation dictates. She legally evicted him from the apartment. Julian's architectural firm suffered a similar fate. For years, he had quietly used my clean financial profile and my steady income as a silent guarantor for his commercial credit lines. When the divorce proceedings were formally filed and the financial separation became a public record, his banks immediately restricted his accounts. Without the illusion of a wealthy, successful physician wife backing him, his investors pulled out. His firm quietly closed its doors before the end of the fiscal year. He was forced to rent a small, deeply unremarkable apartment in a distant suburb. The man who had meticulously designed a luxury life using stolen funds was now living in a space he could barely afford. The family law court ruled entirely in my favour. Julian was ordered to repay the $85,000 he had embezzled, though it would likely take him a decade of instalment payments to fulfil the judgment. I retained full legal and physical custody of Mia. Julian was granted strictly supervised visitation every other weekend. I did not celebrate his downfall. I did not post cryptic messages on social media or gloat to mutual acquaintances. A surgeon does not celebrate throwing away a diseased organ. You simply dispose of the biohazard in the proper receptacle and wash your hands. My life became profoundly peaceful. I no longer walked on eggshells in my own home. I no longer spent my rare days off apologising for working too hard. The heavy, invisible chain of guilt that had choked me for 5 years was completely gone. I paid the property taxes on the brownstone with immense pride. I had protected my father's legacy. I had protected my daughter's future. The silence in my house was no longer tense and judgmental. It was warm, secure, and incredibly calm. The parasite was gone. 6 months after the final divorce decree, I stood near the edge of the Boston Public Garden. The autumn leaves were bright orange and red. I watched Mia happily chasing a golden retriever puppy across the grass. A few feet away, standing awkwardly by a wrought iron bench, was Margaret. She looked significantly older. The haughty, aristocratic posture she had worn in my living room was completely broken. She wore a simple wool coat, clutching a small paper bag from a local bakery. She had spent the last 6 months sending letters to Attorney Sterling, begging for a chance to see her granddaughter. I had finally agreed, under strictly controlled conditions. Margaret walked over to me. She did not look me in the eye. "Thank you, Gemma," she whispered. "I know you did not have to allow this." "I am allowing this because Mia deserves to know her family," I replied smoothly. "But my decisions are based on what is best for her, not what is best for you." Margaret nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I was wrong. I was terrified of losing my son, and I let him convince me that you were the enemy. I will regret what I did for the rest of my life." "You stole from an infant to orchestrate an eviction," I stated. I did not say it with anger. I simply reminded her of the documented truth. An apology does not rewrite history. "Margaret, can I come to the house for her birthday next month?" she asked, her voice trembling with desperate hope. "Just for an hour." I looked at the woman who had pointed at my front door and screamed for me to get out. I felt a sudden, profound sense of absolute authority. "No," I said quietly. Margaret blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Gemma, please. I am her grandmother. You are welcome to schedule supervised visits at the park or at the family centre downtown," I told her, my tone completely unyielding. "But you lost the right to cross the threshold of my home the night you tried to steal it. You will never step foot inside that brownstone again." Margaret lowered her head, accepting the boundary. She handed me the paper bag of cookies and walked slowly toward the bench to watch Mia play from a distance. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but protecting your sanctuary is an absolute necessity. The boundary was permanent. 2 years later, I pushed open the heavy mahogany door to my new office. The plaque on the frosted glass read, "Dr. Gemma, attending surgeon." The room smelled of expensive leather and fresh coffee. I walked behind the large desk and booted up my computer. The space was entirely mine. I had not decorated it with prestigious medical diplomas or complex anatomical charts. Instead, the walls told a different story. On the left wall hung a framed original copy of The Irrevocable Trust, accompanied by a photograph of my father. On the right wall hung a massive, brightly coloured finger painting created by a 3-year-old artist. My life had blossomed in the absence of toxicity. Without the constant financial drain of Julian's failing business and his secret real estate ventures, I had significant surplus capital. I did not buy a luxury car or designer clothes. I established a medical support foundation in my father's name. The foundation provided emergency childcare grants and legal consultation services for single parents working in the healthcare sector. I used the money Julian had tried to steal to ensure other exhausted nurses and doctors never had to choose between saving a patient and protecting their own children. The door to my office opened. Dr. Marcus walked in, carrying 2 cups of cafeteria coffee. He was no longer just my department chief. He, along with Aunt Nora and Attorney Sterling, had become a vital part of my chosen family. They were the people who demanded data before judgment. They were the people who respected the truth. "Are you ready for the board meeting?" Marcus asked, handing me a cup. "I am always ready," I smiled, taking a sip. My phone buzzed with a picture message from Mia's nanny. It was a photo of Mia sitting at the antique oak dining table in our brownstone, her face covered in chocolate frosting, laughing hysterically. The table belonged exactly where it was. It anchored a home filled with genuine joy, completely free from manipulation and deceit. I did not need a traditional husband to complete the picture of a perfect family. I had a brilliant daughter, a thriving surgical career, and a fortress built on absolute integrity. I had survived the ambush, not by matching their cruelty, but by relying on the cold, undeniable power of facts. The victory was incredibly quiet. I stood by the large window of my hospital office, looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline. The city moved with a frantic, chaotic energy. But inside this room, everything was perfectly still. People frequently ask me how I survived a betrayal that attacked my marriage, my career, and my home all at once. They expect a story of dramatic confrontations, tearful screaming matches, and explosive revenge. They expect the chaos of a soap opera. I tell them that chaos is exactly what a manipulator relies on. They want you to panic. They want you to operate entirely on emotion, because emotional people are incredibly easy to record, discredit, and defeat. They use your exhaustion as a weapon. They use your love as a blindfold. But you do not have to play their game. You have the right to remain completely silent. You have the right to gather your data, secure your documents, and build a fortress of verifiable facts. When someone tries to burn your life to the ground, your calm precision is the water that extinguishes their fire. My career as a trauma surgeon taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. When a body is severely injured, you cannot save every single piece of tissue. Sometimes, a limb is crushed beyond repair. Sometimes, the necrosis is spreading too fast. In those critical moments, you have to make a brutal, necessary choice. You have to amputate the necrotic tissue. You do not cut it away because you hate it. You cut it away to save the rest of the body. You sever the infection so the heart can continue to beat. I amputated Julian and his family from my life. I severed the manipulation, the financial drain, and the constant, suffocating guilt. I removed the disease, and in doing so, I allowed my true life to finally breathe. If you are currently trapped in a narrative written by someone who wants to break you, remember this. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the one telling the truth. Guard your peace, gather your evidence, and never apologize for protecting your sanctuary. If my story resonated with you, or if it reminded you of the quiet power of standing your ground, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and the undeniable power of the truth. Thank you for listening.